The rain was relentless, drumming against the windshield like 1,000 impatient fingers. The neon glow of the diner's sign flickered in the darkness, casting eerie reflections on the wet pavement. Inside, the smell of stale coffee and cigarettes hung heavy in the air. I sat in the corner booth, nursing a lukewarm cup of joe, the brim of my fedora casting a shadow over my eyes. It was the kind of night where the world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. In the early 1980s, a string of brutal murders along Route 40 in Delaware shattered the silence of the night. Young women, full of life and promise, were found discarded like trash along the lonely stretch of highway. The community was paralyzed with fear, whispers of a monster in their midst growing louder with each passing day. The press had a name for him, the Route 40 killer. This was no ordinary case. It was a tale of terror that left scars on the small towns that dotted the highway. A nightmare that seemed to have no end. The police were desperate, chasing shadows in the dark, while the killer continued to taunt them with his ability to vanish without a trace. It was the kind of case that could make or break a detective, and it was about to become my obsession. The first body was found in November 1987, and it wouldn't be the last. As the bodies piled up, so did the questions. Who was this predator? Why did he choose Route 40 as his hunting ground? And most importantly, how could we stop him before he struck again? This is the story of the Route 40 killer, a case that pushed the limits of law enforcement and tested the resolve of everyone involved. It's a story of fear, of relentless pursuit, and of the shadows that lurk in the corners of our world. And as the rain continued to fall, I knew this case would take me deeper into the darkness than I had ever gone before. Act 1. The First Murders. The rain had stopped by the time I reached the scene, but the chill in the air was unforgiving. The headlights from the patrol cars illuminated the grim sight ahead, a young woman's lifeless body, lying in the dirt by the side of Route 40. Her name was Shirley Ellis, a 23-year-old nurse, and now the first victim in what would become a series of brutal slayings. The rural stretch of Route 40 had always been quiet, a lonely road that connected small towns and even smaller lives. But now, it was haunted by the specter of death. As I stood over the body, I could feel the weight of what was to come. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was the work of a predator, calculated, cold, and remorseless. The discovery of Shirley's body in November 1987 was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, the bodies of other young women began to surface along the route. Each victim had been bound, beaten, and left to die in the darkness. The similarities were chilling. Each woman had been seen hitchhiking before she vanished. Each was found within a few miles of each other, and each bore the marks of a sadistic killer. The media wasted no time in labeling him the Route 40 killer, and the name stuck. The community was gripped by fear, the kind that seeps into your bones and keeps you awake at night. Parents warned their daughters to stay off the roads, but the killer was always one step ahead. As the bodies piled up, so did the pressure. The Delaware State Police were stretched thin, and the task force they assembled was chasing ghosts. Every lead seemed to vanish into thin air, every clue a dead end. But I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The killer had tasted blood, and he wouldn't stop until he was caught. The investigation was just starting, but already the shadows were growing longer. And as I looked out over the desolate highway, I knew that finding this killer would be like chasing a phantom in the dark. But I also knew that I couldn't stop, not until I brought this monster to justice. Act 2. The Investigation Intensifies. The early morning fog clung to the fields like a shroud as we combed through the latest crime scene. Another young woman. Another life snuffed out on Route 40. The killer was getting bolder, leaving us with fewer clues and more questions. The press was all over it, headlines screaming about the Route 40 killer, turning our hunt into a spectacle. But to us, it was personal. The Delaware State Police were out in full force, and the task force had grown in numbers, but we were no closer to catching the killer. The rural setting worked against us. No witnesses, no cameras, just long stretches of road and endless possibilities for where the killer could strike next. We were chasing shadows, trying to anticipate his next move, but he always seemed to be one step ahead. I was getting frustrated. Every day I pored over the files, studied the maps, and re-interviewed anyone who might have seen something, anything. But the leads were few and far between. The killer's ability to vanish without a trace was maddening, as if he was a ghost haunting the highways, leaving no footprints behind. We tried everything: profiling, roadblocks, undercover operations, but nothing seemed to work. The killer's psychological profile suggested someone with deep-seated rage, a man who saw these women as objects, not people. But who was he? And how did he blend in so perfectly that no one ever saw him coming? The tension in the task force was palpable. Every dead end felt like a personal failure. Every new body was a reminder that we were losing this game. But I wasn't about to give up. The killer's arrogance, his belief that he could keep getting away with it, was his weakness. And we were determined to exploit it. The hunt was intensifying, but so was the fear. The community was on edge, and so were we. The killer had the advantage, but we had something he didn't: relentless determination. We knew he'd make a mistake, and when he did, we'd be ready. But as the days turned into weeks, and the body count continued to rise, the question lingered. How many more lives would be lost before we could bring this monster to justice? Act 3. The Breakthrough. The air was thick with tension, the kind that presses down on your shoulders and squeezes the breath from your lungs. We were nearing the end of our rope, the killer still at large, and the fear in the community had reached a fever pitch. But then, in the most unexpected way, we caught a break, a slim thread that could lead us to the man who had turned Route 40 into a killing field. It started with a witness, a woman who had seen something she couldn't shake. She had been driving down Route 40 late one night, when she noticed a car pulled over on the side of the road. In the dim light, she saw a man talking to a young woman. Something about the scene didn't sit right with her. The way the man leaned in too close, the way the woman looked nervous, trapped. The witness drove on, but the image stayed with her. When she heard about the murders, she came forward. The description was vague, but it was more than we had before. A man in his 30s or 40s, dark hair, driving a blue van. It wasn't much, but it was something. We knew that the killer had to be local. He knew the roads too well, struck too quickly. The blue van became our focus. The task force redoubled their efforts, canvassing the area, checking every lead. And then a piece of physical evidence surfaced. A single hair found on one of the victims that didn't match hers. It was the first solid piece of evidence we had, and it was enough to start narrowing down our suspects. The tension in the squad room was electric as we pieced together the clues, each one pulling the noose tighter around the killer's neck. We were close, and we could feel it. I was more determined than ever and pushed myself to look at every angle, consider every possibility. The killer's days were numbered, and he had to know it. The breakthrough gave us a renewed sense of purpose. The dark cloud that had hung over the investigation for so long was beginning to lift. We could see the end in sight, but we also knew that the most dangerous part of the hunt was still ahead. The killer was out there, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. But we were ready. The pieces were falling into place, and soon, the Route 40 killer would have nowhere left to hide. Act 4. The Capture. The rain was relentless that night, pouring down in sheets as I sat in my car, cigarette smoke curling up towards the cracked window. We were close, closer than we'd ever been. The streets were quiet, the only sound the rhythmic thrum of raindrops against the roof. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was well past midnight, but sleep was the furthest thing from my mind. We had our man. A blue van, a description that matched, and a hair that didn't belong to the victim. It all pointed to one person, Stephen Brian Pennell. The name had come up before, but until now, we didn't have enough to pin him down. Now, we did. The plan was simple, but the stakes were high. We'd set up a surveillance operation, watching his every move, waiting for him to make a mistake. He was smart, but like all predators, he was also arrogant. He thought he could outsmart us, that he could keep slipping through our fingers. But this time, we had him cornered. I parked my car a few blocks away from his house, the engine idling softly as I watched the darkened windows. The tension in the air was palpable, every nerve in my body on edge. This was the moment we'd been waiting for, the culmination of months of frustration, dead ends, and sleepless nights. The hours dragged by, each minute stretching out like an eternity. But then, just as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, he made his move. The van pulled out of the driveway, headlights cutting through the gloom. My hand tightened on the steering wheel as I radioed the team. It was time. We tailed him, careful to keep our distance, not wanting to spook him. He drove with the casual confidence of a man who had done this 100 times before, who thought he was untouchable. But this time, we were ready. When he finally pulled over to the side of the road, the same stretch of Route 40 that had become his hunting ground, we moved in. The headlights of our cars illuminated the scene, casting long shadows across the wet pavement. Pennell barely had time to react before we had him out of the van, cuffs snapping around his wrists. As I looked into his eyes, I saw none of the fear or remorse you'd expect. Just cold, calculated indifference. He knew it was over, but there was no satisfaction in his capture. No triumph. Just the heavy weight of knowing that for all the lives he had destroyed, his end would be as unremarkable as the man himself. The Route 40 killer had finally been caught, but the real work was just beginning. The trial, the evidence, the long road to justice. It all lay ahead. But in that moment, as the rain finally began to let up, I allowed myself a small measure of relief. The hunt was over, but the shadows left behind would linger for a long time. Act 5. The Trial and Aftermath. The courtroom was a far cry from the rain-soaked streets where we'd hunted him down, but the tension in the air was just as thick. Pennell sat at the defense table, a picture of calm indifference, as though he was watching someone else's life unfold. But this was his moment of reckoning, and there was no escape this time. The prosecution laid out the case with meticulous detail, piece by piece tearing apart the facade Pennell had built. The physical evidence was damning. A single hair, fibers from his van that matched those found on the victims, and the witness testimony that placed him at the scene. But it was the forensic evidence, the cold, hard science, that sealed his fate. The DNA match was the final nail in his coffin, indisputable and inescapable. As the evidence piled up, I watched Pennell closely. There was no remorse, no flicker of emotion, just the same cold detachment he'd shown the night we arrested him. He was a man who had lived in the shadows, and now those shadows were closing in on him. The families of the victims sat in the gallery, their faces etched with the pain of loss and the weight of finally confronting the man who had taken so much from them. I couldn't help but think of the long nights, the dead ends, and the relentless pursuit that had led us here. But even as the jury returned their verdict, guilty on all counts, the sense of closure was elusive. Justice in cases like this is a hollow victory. It doesn't bring back the lives lost, doesn't erase the fear and pain that linger long after the killer is caught. But it's something, and in this world, something is often the best you can hope for. Pennell was sentenced to death, and the Route 40 killer was no more. But the case left its mark, not just on the families, but on all of us who had hunted him. The long hours, the frustration, the moments of doubt. It all came flooding back as the trial drew to a close. As I walked out of the courthouse into the cold, gray morning, I couldn't help but think about the victims, the lives cut short by a man who saw them as nothing more than prey. The case was over, but the memories would linger. They always do. Justice had been served, but it came at a price. And as I lit a cigarette and watched the smoke curl into the air, I knew that the darkness we chased in cases like this never really goes away. It just waits for the next shadow to fall.